District of Columbia, seat of the nation's capital and epicenter of global power. Tourism, business, domestic and global affairs draw more than 20 million visitors to this 68 square mile plot every year. It's an international city with cosmopolitan flair. But D.C. has a hometown heartbeat. It's 8 wards, 700,000 residents, schools, daycare, public health, and public works. It's parking, housing, and festivals. It's citywide events and citywide concerns. D.C. is home. The city's governance and fiduciary lie with the mayor and city council. Together, they manage the services and needs of the city. But it hasn't always been this way. Before 1974, there was no elected city council or mayor. Before 1974, it was largely 100 years of government from presidentially appointed teams of commissioners. But all along, there's been a fight to enfranchise D.C. residents. The fight for self-determination and congressional representation in D.C. is nearly as old as the nation itself. It began more than 2 centuries ago. The year was 1790. The country was young, and it was fragile.
Think of it, if you will, as a vexatious problem.
Ironically, the biggest challenge for self-determination in the nation's capital was presented by one of our most important documents, the very treatise that was meant to ensure our rights, the Constitution.
The constitutional provision was Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that gave the federal government complete powers and jurisdiction over this territory called the district. That was also, in a sense, a compromise because there was a question as to how our national capital would be governed itself. And by this article, it permitted the federal government to have complete jurisdiction over this new place called the District of Columbia, a 10 square mile place carved out of slave plantations in Maryland and Virginia.
The battle was rooted in the trifecta of slavery, money, and politics. Slavery, with its profound impact on commerce and wealth, shaped almost every political issue. And the first item to negotiate was where to locate the capital city.
The northern states did not want the capital in a southern location, and vice versa. Ultimately, the compromise would revolve around the assumption of northern debt by everyone if, on the other hand, the nation's capital could be placed in a southern location.
The Compromise of 1790 and the Residence Act of 1790 were agreements worked out between Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Together, the accords led to the decision to nestle the capital city on the shores of the Potomac River. But neither pact offered any provisions for self-determination for city residents.
The Residence Act really was an act by Congress that gave the authority to the President of the United States to find the exact location that Professor Gibbs was talking about. And that location, he liked the Potomac River. He liked the Potomac River watershed. He lived in this area. Obviously, he was at Mount Vernon. And he came down and surveyed the Potomac River basin. And he went up to Great Falls, and he realized that you can't put a nation's capital above the falls. He had a fall line. The fall line, where we see Georgetown University is up on a hill. That was part of the fall line. We're down below the fall line where the present White House exists. And so the President of the United States had the authority to place this new District of Columbia in the Potomac Basin. He, of course, chose a place that would be convenient for his house, which was part of the reason it was here. But really it was because of this compromise between the North and the South. Slavery is still raging at this time. And of course, he saw Alexandria and Georgetown as deep water ports. And so the port of Georgetown, the port of Alexandria, were tobacco commodity ports, trading in both slaves and tobacco. And that was an ideal place for the new seat of government.
The Residence Act itself allows the capital to be put somewhere between the eastern branch and the Conococheague River. And Washington will send survey teams to determine exactly where in that expanse the new capital will be.
At this time, the federal city was comprised of 5 units: Washington City, Georgetown, Washington County in Maryland, Alexandria, and the County of Alexandria in Virginia. People living in some of these districts could vote, while people who lived in others couldn't. And there were many who opposed the disparity.
Not a man in the district would be represented in the government, whereas every man who contributed to the support of a government ought to be represented in it. Otherwise, his natural rights were subverted, and he was left not a citizen, but a subject.
In 1802, citizens in Washington City petitioned for a charter that incorporated the city and allowed them to vote for a council that could pass laws and levy taxes to pay for services. Even so, this form of self-government was limited. First, only white male landowners could vote for council members. And second, the President of the United States appointed the mayor to oversee the council. What followed were decades of charters, big councils, small councils, commissioners, and flip-flopping regulations and laws. Some of these regulations gave D.C. residents voting rights, while others took them away. But in 1862, the Compensated Emancipation Act gave something more. It gave freedom to the city slaves.
It is a step forward, perhaps a timid step, when you compare to what was already happening in, for example, the British Empire, which had already abolished the slave trade in 1807 and would outlaw slavery and free its enslaved people in 1834. So we look at the United States tiptoeing through up to what is clearly becoming a self-evident conclusion, that this institution of bondage and blood and death is not much longer. We can't put a bet on how long it's going to take, but the end is in sight. And the end will come with the Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862. Just like the freeing of enslaved people in the British Empire, they're going to use a form of compensated emancipation in the British Empire. The district will use compensated emancipation in order to rid itself of what one publication called this evil that divides the United States from the rest of the civilized world.
The district's desire for voting rights never waned or faltered, and it has long been a companion to the struggle Black people waged for dignity and human rights.
In 1870, right before the territorial government of 1871, African-American men are granted the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. 7,000 African-American men registered to vote compared to only 1,000 white men registering to vote at that same time. So African-Americans are already, they're free, Black men are free and then free to vote, and now you're beginning to build a political empowerment opportunity. Howard University is founded in 1867, and all this is beginning to come about at the same time, and quite frankly, we're in the middle of Reconstruction, and it's not going to last too long, but it was a flurry of emancipated activity.
Those periods are marked by a great deal of self-reliance. We see individuals who are behind the founding of churches, who are at least prior to the Civil War for free Blacks, the establishment of schools, and also the beginning of African-American self-help societies such as the Resolute Beneficial Association. If the city would not help you, if you could not get insurance, if the place where you were going to be buried was uncertain, free Blacks and enslaved Blacks, to the extent that they could, came together and worked for a better society and a better attempt at life.
We are all very proud of ourselves in Washington, D.C. as being the Black Mecca of America, Howard University, and this amazing African-American middle class and professional class we have. But it starts right there in the beginning of free African-Americans in this place where they are stuck between two major slave states, Virginia and Maryland. Yet in 1800, early on, African-Americans are getting free in many different ways, by hook or by crook, and they're freeing other people. And so what we find out, what we see, Washington, D.C. becomes one of the freest communities in America, as well as one of the leaders in helping the rest of America get free.
In 1871, the district was declared a territory. This action was devoid of congressional representation for the city, but it did help deliver dignity and rights for Black people.
The charters of Georgetown and the district are basically tossed in the waste bin, and the district is declared a territory with a governor and a secretary and an elective body. And this is good news for African Americans in this town. Frederick Douglass has a brief flirtation with it. His son is going to follow him. This is a chance, even over and above what happened in the late 1860s, to have a larger Black presence on the, if you will, the city council. And we get incredibly accomplished men of mark. Solomon Brown, who is a poet, who is the first Black employee of the Smithsonian, and who has a memorial grove right outside the Museum of Natural History. He is a man who is a scientist, a scholar, a poet, author, and who worked with not only Joseph Henry, a leader in the early Smithsonian, but also with Morse, with the telegraph. So we have wonderful individuals who bring together this wonderful synthesis of skills that are allowed to flourish in that brief burst of political freedom known as the territorial government, because it's not going to last.
The territorial government was abolished in 1874 and replaced by 1878's Organic Act, which gave Congress control of the city's budget and again called for presidentially appointed commissioners. 3 of them. District residents would live with this form of government for nearly 100 years. Change would slowly come. In the mid-1960s, as the nation teetered on the edge of imploding, a Southern president stepped forward, and the tide began to change. But the battle for home rule would wage on for nearly a decade more.